is Del D'Annunzio, and thank you for joining C.C. Sloan's Salon. Try saying that 3 times. Presenting Carol Glenn, C.C. Sloan, and Gila Zalon in 3 Women Hidden in Plain Sight. One by one in this Zoom hour, they will introduce you to the universes of 3 creative women who, a century ago, found the forces that would help shape their human thinking. We have Salka Viertel, Hollywood screenwriter and salonista, born 1889 in Ukraine. Anzia Yezierska, New York novelist and author, born around 1885 in Russia, Poland. Charlotte Cushman, U.S. Shakespearean actress, born 1816, Boston, Massachusetts. Each discourse will run about 15 minutes. Please save your questions for the discussion to follow all 3 speakers. Now, without further ado, let's hear about Salka Viertel.
Salka Viertel, born 1889 in Austria. Salka was a vital presence during the 1930s and 40s in Hollywood. She was a true bohemian with a rather complicated erotic love life. One of her lovers was actually 23 years younger, and their relationship lasted for 10 years. And there was also a suspected lesbian relationship with Garbo. Salka's autobiography, The Kindness of Strangers, is a portrait of 2 worlds, pre-Hitler European stage and the pre-CGI Hollywood. Salka was born Salome Sternum of Austrian Jewish parents in 1889 in Austria. She had a privileged childhood and grew up in an atmosphere of culture. Beginning her professional career at 17, in a few years she was working with Max Reinhardt, a prominent German director of that era. And he was also the father of the lover that I had mentioned before, the one that's 23 years younger. While working in Vienna, Salka met writer-director Bertold Viertel. 5 years later, he divorced his first wife and married Salka. In 1928, Bertold had received a contract with Fox Films, and before leaving for the United States, he and Salka were invited to a dinner in Vienna with Dorothy Thompson, the fiancée of Sinclair Lewis. Lewis didn't speak German, and the Viertels' English was limited, so the conversation was challenging, even though Salka had taken the time and prepared by reading his Nobel-winning prize novel, Arrowsmith, and Bertold had memorized Shakespeare's sonnets. Sinclair Lewis, tall and gaunt, had no idea who we were. After each martini, we smiled at each other. Well, the Viertels came to Los Angeles in 1928 and initially lived on Fairfax Avenue, which was close to his work. However, as a child, a gypsy had foretold that Salka would only be happy and escape heartache and misfortune if she lived near water. Even though it meant an additional half-hour travel time for Bertold, Salka headed straight for the Pacific coast. She found her home at Inspiration Point, and for the next 30 years, this house on Mabury Road became a vital center for the extraordinary circle of writers, actors, composers, and musicians. Many of these had fled Europe, and the Viertels' home became a place of shelter for their friends. Salka performed as a connector of people with genuine warmth and panache. She served wedges of superior chocolate cake and much, much more. On Sunday afternoon salons, alliances were formed, and she commanded the room, something she had not had an opportunity to do since her time on the German stage. Among her list of guests were Thomas and Heinrich Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Ernest Lubitsch, Sergei Eisenstein, Arnold Schoenberg, Christopher Isherwood, and Aldous Huxley, as well as every kind of Hollywood star from Chaplin to Johnny Weissmuller to Shelley Winters. In Europe, Salka had had success on the German-Austrian stage. In America, she played Marthy in the German language version of Anna Christie. The part had been played by Marie Dressler in the earlier that year English language version, but Garbo had suggested Salka for the part in the German language version. She deemed herself neither beautiful nor young enough to have a film career in Hollywood, so she transitioned to screenwriting. While working on Anna Christie, she had become inspired by a biography of Queen Christina of Sweden. Her masculine education and complicated sexuality made her an almost contemporary character. Well, Garbo urged her to write a screenplay based on the Queen's life, and Garbo showed an early draft to Irving Thalberg, who was keen to lure Garbo to the MGM lot. Thalberg tried to sideline Salka, considering her an inexperienced European outsider, but she stood her ground. Salka remained on board as the creative force behind Garbo's most complex role as Queen Christina. And at one point, during the Irving Thalberg years, Salka was the highest paid screenwriter on the MGM lot. Now, her friendship with the younger Garbo became quite intimate, often co-authoring her scripts. There was the doctor's adulterous wife in The Painted Veil, Maria Waleska, Napoleon's adulterous Polish lover, Marie Curie, the adulterous Polish Nobel Prize-winning chemist, and Anna Karenina, the legendary Russian, well, you get the point. Anyway, in 1993, Sotheby's sold letters written to Salka by Garbo. Most of the letters were undated, written in pencil, and signed GG. Salka, I know I'm an impossible person. I go nowhere, see no one, just like in Brentwood. Perhaps you will come and rescue me. It's hard and sad to be alone, but sometimes it's even more difficult to be with someone. I remain a rather confused, tired boy. Oh, you mean frightfully much to me. I hope you know that. Garbo asked Salka to burn the letter immediately, as she didn't want it to end up in a museum where its contents might make people laugh at Salka, at Garbo. She closed the letter with a drawing of a circus lady. She often did not sign her letters, particularly to good friends, because of her obsession for privacy. Now, in another letter written in 1955, a time when Garbo was no longer making films in America, she writes, I have disappeared in the wilderness. I am sitting in a little homemade house, practically a prisoner because I don't want anyone to know I am here. If you feel writing to me, you can write to occupant. That's my name. 1672 Saratoga Road, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Oh, please don't mix up things and put my name on the envelope, because then I will have to leave. Well, while at MGM, one of Salka's favorite writing partners was Sam Berlman. He had asked Salka to dictate to the secretary the shots of Anna Karenina's suicide, the last scene in the film. Walking up and down, I described the night train approaching relentlessly, the lights from carriage windows on Anna's face, her running down the embankment and throwing herself between the cars, then a prostrated figure on the rails, the train disappearing in darkness, and last, a woman's handbag on the embankment. And that's what's left of a human being. I concluded almost in tears and turned to Sam, who burst into roars of laughter. Well, for years thereafter, these words remained our special code. We signed letters and telegrams. What's left of a human being? Now, in her memoir, The Kindness of Strangers, Salka tells tales of fish decidedly out of water, those European emigres. She tells stories of Schoenberg, Heinrich Mann, and Bertolt Brecht, all of them utterly squandered by the Hollywood studio system, had no idea what to do with them. Many of these Central European cultural emigres found themselves improperly beached on the West Coast. They joke about the two dachshunds who met in Santa Monica. Here it is true, I'm a dachshund, the one admits to the other. But in the old country, I was a Saint Bernard. Salka spent a lot of time sending and receiving telegrams as she worked to help her friends trying to flee Europe. There was a sweet lady in the Santa Monica office at Western Union. For many years, tables and telegrams and cables were read to me by the gentle voice of my invisible friend. This is Western Union. I only wanted to tell you that the sun is shining. It's such a lovely day. I worried about you, honey. Your telegram sounded so sad. Well, Salka never met her in person, although she sometimes went to Western Union hoping to find her there. Salka had helped many fund the European Film Fund, which brokered contracts with major Hollywood studios. And many notable artists, such as Heinrich Mann and many, many others, received emergency visas, enabling them to escape the Nazis. Well, for all her success, the life was exhausting. And as the war came to an end, her own life was beginning to fall apart. Her marriage with Bertold was continuing to deteriorate. Both of them had been carrying on love affairs, and both were ending badly. The perversities of studio life were becoming less and less endurable, and in 1947, Salka, now at Warner Brothers, was contemplating finishing the screenplay for one of her relatively non-Garbo, non-adulterous films. One day, the studio workers went out on strike. Salka, like most of the writers there, honored the picket line. However, her writing partner on that film refused to be intimidated by communists and ostentatiously crossed the line. Salka was one of the Hollywood writers suspected of being a communist. Suddenly, her contacts with the glamorous Hollywood started to dissolve. The screenplays based on the life of George Sand she had written for Garbo was sidelined. Utterly disillusioned with the endless delays, Garbo herself renounced the screen. Chaplin left for Europe, and good friends Thalberg and Lubitsch had died prematurely. It was only when Bertold fell seriously ill and he had left for Europe. Salka needed to renew her U.S. passport to visit him in Switzerland, and then she found out that she had been blacklisted. But thanks again to the kindness of strangers, she was able to secure a 4-month restricted passport. When her script work had dried up, she could no longer pay for that mortgage on the Inspiration Point house. Over the years, Salka had taken out loans on the house to help her friends, but now she was reluctantly forced to sell it. But at least it was to a dear friend and associate, John Houseman. In 1933, Salka moved to Klosters, Switzerland, where her middle son, Peter, had also settled. He was also a screenwriter, and he settled there with his second wife, the actress Deborah Kerr. Old Hollywood friends came to visit, and Garbo would often stay for weeks at a time. There, she wrote her autobiography, The Kindness of Strangers. She herself had been kind to many, many strangers, and a friend suggested that The Incorrigible Heart would be a fitting title for her work, and that was the title used in the German edition. Salka died October 20th, 1978. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Now we'll hear from Cece Sloan telling us about Anzia Yezierska.
My one story is hunger. So said the protagonist of Anzia Yezierska's novel, Children of Loneliness. My story today is about Anzia Yezierska, an immigrant from Eastern Europe who chronicled the hunger of her generation of newly arrived Jewish Americans around the turn of the century. The tenements, women's experiences, father and daughter struggles, Polish ghetto origins, sweatshops of New York City, and those class tensions. Her novels, short stories, and autobiographical writing vividly depict both the literal hunger of poverty and the metaphoric hunger for security, education, companionship, home, and meaning. In short, the American dream. Born in the Russian Poland village Plinsk, near Warsaw between 1880 and 1885, the youngest of 9 children, she arrived in the US with her family in the early 1890s. However, the year of her birth date is uncertain, not only because she didn't recollect the exact date, but also, according to her daughter, because she constantly reinvented her history in the interviews that she gave, frequently claiming to be younger to compensate for the relatively late start as a writer. Her eldest brother, Meyer, preceded the family by several years. Immigration officers Americanized his name into Max Mayer, replacing his last name with a version of his first. So when Anzia landed in the US at Castle Garden, the entire family was given the surname Mayer, and Anzia was given the name Harriet, later changed to Hattie, and then actually she reclaimed the name Anzia Yezierska at about the age of 28. A cramped tenement apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan is where they settled, one family in 100,000 Jews seeking security and prosperity in the New World. Her father, Baruch, translated as Bernard, a Talmudic scholar engaged in full-time study of sacred books, was not gainfully employed. Her mother, Pearl, worked at menial jobs to support the family. Pressured to help support her struggling family in a cultural climate that did not legitimate girls' aspirations for education, she had to attend elementary school for 2 years before working at a succession of domestic menial jobs. 4 of her brothers studied pharmacy. Another became a high school math teacher, and another an army colonel. Young Anzia clashed frequently with her father, whose poverty, religious observance, and Eastern European ways she saw as barriers to full entry into American life. She did whatever she wanted to in outrage of this tyrannical father. She left home at the age of 17, worked in sweatshops and laundries, lived in dark and smelly halls until she learned enough English to begin writing. She paid a janitor's little daughter to teach her the lessons from her school books. She went to night school. Eventually, she moved into the Clara de Hirsch Home for Working Girls, continuing her ambition for education with a single-minded determination. According to her daughter Louise, she promised her patrons that she would become a domestic science teacher to help better her people, and she invented a high school education for her application to Columbia University. Continuing to support herself by menial work, she attended Columbia University's Teachers College on scholarship from 1901 for 5 years. New country, new century, new world. She then taught elementary school during those years, during which time she married Jacob Gordon, a lawyer, but applied for an annulment the next day, explaining that while she valued his friendship, she was unprepared for the physical aspect of marriage. She took a brief leave of absence from teaching to attend the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and then began to write. At this point, if this were an interview, I might be asked a question. If all this really happened for her then, and records showed that it did, what changed at Columbia University 20 years later when there was a quota on both women and Jewish men, particularly at the medical school? She married Arnold Levitas, a teacher and textbook writer in a religious but not a civil ceremony. Their daughter, Louise Levitas, was born in 1912. A couple of years later, she left him and took Louise to San Francisco, worked there as a social worker, but couldn't really support herself and her daughter. So Louise was sent to live with Levitas in New York when she was 5 years old. They divorced. Yezierska's relationship with her daughter remained close but troubled. Years later, Louise described her mother as a vibrant, daring, and courageous person, but one whose extreme mood swings and egoism affected all her personal interactions. In 1917, Yezierska met John Dewey, a Columbia University educator, philosopher, and a major believer in democracy. Despite the age difference of 20 years, she fell for him romantically. She audited his seminar in social and political thought. Dewey was attracted by Yezierska's outspokenness, her emotionality and passion. She, by his erudition and intellect. It would take a full semester about Dewey to cover his brilliance, but he was smitten by her. Dewey wrote many poems about her through the years, while he served in her writing as a prototype Anglo-Saxon Gentile mentor lover. She treated the relations fictionally in her book, All I Could Never Be, published later in 1932. According to her daughter, Yezierska used his poems and phrases from his letters uncredited in her writing. Their relationship was fictionalized in Norma Rosen's John and Anzia, an American romance published in 1989. The breaking point in the relationship came when he made a sexual overture to her. Now she is really ready to write and begins to send off her pieces. Yezierska's fiction focuses on Jewish immigrant life at the turn of the century, and she sees herself as giving voice to her people. Her work features female protagonists and explores the transition from, quote, greenhorn, unquote, to American, the struggle against patriarchy, poverty, and restrictive Jewish practice, the striving for acceptance. Yezierska pays particularly attention to the hardships of childcare. In contrast to the ineffectual or exploited Jewish immigrant man, she frequently features a liaison with a sophisticated WASP or an assimilated man who functions as a mentor. Her first published piece, The Free Vacation House, exposes the humiliation inflicted upon poor women by well-intentioned charitable organizations. Based on her sister Helena's experience, the story's free country house for poor mothers and children is so rule-bound that the guests who are forbidden to sit on the comfortable chairs in front of the house or on the porch experience it as prison. She then wrote The Fat of the Land, and following that, collections of stories, Hungry Hearts and Salome of the Tenements, both made into Hollywood silent films, Children of Loneliness, Bread Givers, Arrogant Beggar, and the last novel, in the beginning of her writing decline in 1928, All I Could Never Be. Such colorful titles, if only the contents were less grim. She was on the edge of poverty and then suddenly was a screenwriter. She was catapulted briefly to fame and fortune when her book, Hungry Hearts, caught the attention of Samuel Goldwyn, who based a film on it. She had fame, praise, success, riches beyond her wildest dreams. Articles featured the rags to riches girl. The literati world competed on the honor of discovering her. Her pages were covered with color and action, but she felt empty. Although Goldwyn brought Yezierska to Hollywood as a screenwriter, she found her writing blocked amid the wealth and so removed from the culture that she knew. She refused his $100,000 contract and returned to economic struggle in New York. In 1930, she worked for the WPA Writers Project, cataloging trees in Central Park. In the 50s, she wrote book reviews for the New York Times, primarily on Jewish or women's themes, which she universalized for their importance. Her autobiography, Red Ribbons on a White Horse, is considered vibrant and factually unreliable. She wrote of the plight of the Puerto Rican Americans in New York, and during the last decade of her life, she explored the theme of aging, the diminution of one's faculties. Her last published story, quote, "Take up your bed and walk," unquote, puts forth the perspective of an elderly Jewish woman. Finally, critical assessment of her work has fluctuated since her earliest publications. Initially lauded as an authentic voice of the tenements, Cinderella of the sweatshops, by the 40s, Yezierska had fallen into obscurity, seen by the American mainstream as, quote, too Jewish, unquote. Within that community, her writing was offensive to both immigrant and Americanized Jews who felt mocked and exposed. Because of the growing interest in both ethnic and women's writing, the 1980s saw a resurgence of appreciation for her writing. Her book, Bread Givers, was reissued in 1975, followed by editions of many of her other works. Most contemporary critics approach her work sociologically rather than aesthetically, drawn by her compelling depictions of cultural and geographic displacement, the American dream, and the harsh reality of immigrant life and the struggle to acculturate. In the main, she has been seen as aesthetically inferior to other writers of the Jewish immigrant and assimilation experience. Many critics praise the raw power of her writing, but see in it no real artistry. They cite the proliferation of stock characters, the overworked mother, the ineffectual father, the intellectual Gentile or assimilated male savior, the cold wasp, the rootless Americanized Jew, the condescending social worker, the passionate and intelligent young Jewish immigrant woman. Often readers read the work as veiled autobiography, taking the voice of her protagonist as her own. Again, appreciation arises in the publishing field for her oeuvre as a crafted literary work. In a biography of Yezierska, her daughter discusses her mother's inventiveness and also contrasts the stylist Yinglish dialect of the fiction with her mother's more proper, standardized English. Some contemporary readers note her artful use of metaphor, her ability to present multiple points of view, and the broad humor of her exaggerated types. Along with other American women writers emerging like Kate Chopin, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Edith Wharton, Anzia was listed and taught in both college courses, and individual women's studies programs. I discovered her in the 90s and fell in love with her. She died of a stroke in 1970 in Ontario, California, almost Hollywood again. Thank you.
Thank you, Cece. And now we'll hear from Gila Zalon telling us about Charlotte Cushman.
Charlotte Cushman is probably the most famous American actress of her time that we've never heard of, or most of us anyway. So who was she? Just for fun, I decided to compare her to a near contemporary that most of us have heard of. Her name was Sarah Bernhardt. Charlotte was born 25 years before Sarah, and of course, Sarah was French, while Charlotte was born in Boston. Both actresses turned to acting in order to support themselves. Charlotte's father died when she was 13, and as the oldest child, she was responsible for her family. Sarah was a bastard. She never knew her father, and her mother was unable to provide. So I guess her choice was acting or prostitution. Turning to the stage, both women had their professional acting debuts at the age of 19, and both portrayed a number of male roles, including, notably, that of Hamlet. Both were considered the most talented, successful, and prestigious actresses of their time. And that ends my comparison. Now to Charlotte. I'll start by saying that I have every right to call my subject Charlotte rather than the more formal Ms. Cushman, since she was so famous and beloved that newspapers called her by just her first name. So, Charlotte was born in Boston, where there are highly recognized music and theatrical venues. Friends of her family recognized her unusual contralto singing voice and gave her music lessons at a very young age. By the time she was 14, she was singing in concerts and made her professional debut a few years later, singing the part of the Countess in The Marriage of Figaro. She did so well, she was soon engaged as First Lady in the cavernous St. Charles Theater in New Orleans. Convinced that she needed to hit the rafters in every part she sang, she overused her voice and developed vocal problems that ended her singing career and left her with an uncommonly deep speaking voice. The manager of another New Orleans theater suggested she take up acting, and he immediately asked her to do the part of Lady Macbeth in a benefit performance he was arranging. Now, think of this. She had never studied acting. She probably had never acted in a non-singing role. And he goes and puts her in the female lead of Shakespeare's Macbeth? Wow. And she was only 19 years old. She was clearly nervous, and she had to find her own costume. Actors were expected to supply their own wardrobe in those days, but somehow it all worked out to the satisfaction of the manager and the audience, and Charlotte's life course was settled. Her next adventure brought her to New York. The manager of the esteemed Park Theater said he'd be willing to give her a trial. A trial might have eventually led to a secure future, but after New Orleans, that didn't sit well with her. The young thespian had tasted success and wasn't willing to now take a lowly position. But she was saved by the bell when Thomas Hamblin, the manager of the Bowery Theater, asked her to audition for him, which of course she did, leading to an offer of a 3-year contract at $25 a week. Suffice it to say, she accepted immediately. She wasn't quite 20 years old. She had performed in only one dramatic play before this, and she was now about to earn the equivalent of $500 a week in today's money. With things going so well, Charlotte sent for her mother and her younger brother to live with her in New York. Of course, you can't expect everything to run smoothly in the life of a dramatic heroine. 1 week before she was to open at the Bowery, she became seriously ill and was unable to appear for 3 weeks. In the fourth week, she played 2 or 3 roles a night, including a repeat of her successful Lady Macbeth. Now, I don't know how this would affect an ordinary actress, and my guess is most actors had to abide by similar routines in those days to satisfy the curiosity of the audience and the pockets of the managers. But for Charlotte, it was a little too much, and she once more ended up in bed. And worse, while convalescing, the Bowery Theater had a disastrous fire. So, of course, she couldn't complete her contract since there was no theater to complete it in. So, with her mother and young brother, she traveled to Albany, where the governor was her mother's cousin. She got a 5-week contract at a theater there and was so successful, both on stage and off, that her 5 weeks turned into 5 months. But once again, all of her success and feelings of accomplishment were undermined, this time by the death of her brother, who was thrown from a horse that she had given him as a present. The guilt and the grief that followed was indescribable. In her words, "I lost him by a cruel accident, and again the world seemed to liquefy beneath my feet, and the waters went over my soul. It became necessary that I should suffer bodily to cure my heartbleed. I placed myself professionally where I found and knew all the mortifications in my profession. Thus, conquering my art, I would conquer my grief and myself." Thus humbled, she returned to the Park Theater in New York and accepted a 3-year contract as what they called a walking lady, and for general utility business. In other words, she was everybody's understudy, was cast in any and every part nobody else was doing, and probably did a few other backstage jobs as well. Since her contract didn't begin until the fall season, Charlotte spent the summer in theaters around the East Coast, New York, Boston, Buffalo, and others. And during that brief season, she had the opportunity to perform her first male role, that of Henry in Speed the Plow, and then on to New York to fulfill her 3-year contract at the Park Theater, which was grueling. Somewhere towards the end of her 3rd year, her Cinderella story began. The kind of story that makes for plays like 42nd Street or movies like A Star is Born. It seems that just before a performance of a play called Guy Mannering, the actress who played the role of Meg Merrilies took ill. It wasn't a role that people generally cared about, and so nothing out of the ordinary was expected from Charlotte, who was stepping into the part for that performance. And she herself didn't expect anything unusual, since, as she had seen it played by the actress who was now ill, it didn't look like much of a part. But as she waited in the wings and watched for her entrance, she heard the characters on stage speak about her character as if she was no longer in her right mind. And that clued her in to how she would present this performance. At her cue, she came bounding in a weird and terrible manner, which took the leading man, Mr. Braham, by surprise, and probably the audience as well. In fact, Braham headed right for Charlotte's dressing room right after the show, and this is how she describes it. "I had not thought that I had done anything remarkable, and when the knock came at my dressing room door and I heard Braham's voice, my first thought was, 'Ooh, now what have I done? He is surely displeased with me about something.' But Braham was ecstatic in his praise. I have come to thank you for the most veritable sensation I have experienced for a long time. Well, her reviews and the audience response equaled that of Mr. Braham, and she was an overnight success after 4 years of hard work as a novice actress. And with that role, she found her voice. She brought to each part she did after that a physical energy and emotional intensity that was not usual for the stage at that time. Charlotte changed the art of acting and soon became one of the most admired and acclaimed actresses of her time. By the time she left the Park Theater, she had acted in over 30 different plays, in 1/3 of the roles playing the part of a man. It's true that women played breeches roles or pants roles fairly often in those days. The difference is in how she portrayed the men. Most female actresses were immediately recognizable as pretty young women. Some say that wearing tights or pants titillated the men in the audience. But in Charlotte's case, she was immediately accepted as being a man in each of her male roles. When warranted, she was strong and aggressive, and when called for, as in the part of Romeo, she could be sweet and loving. And it didn't hurt that her voice was dramatically quite deep. So, speaking of Romeo, Charlotte is known to have played Romeo opposite her sister Susan's Juliet. How did that happen? Well, it seems that at the age of 14, Susan was forced by her grandfather into a marriage with a 60-something friend of his. But when, a year into their marriage, she bore him a child, the old geezer up and disappeared, leaving Susan to her fate. Luckily, she had Charlotte, who convinced her to take up acting. Charlotte coached her sister to play the part of Juliet to her Romeo. It was a great success, and her sister's career was begun. She was brought on board at the Park Theater and given a number of small parts to do. Sometime during that season, Charlotte approached the theater manager and asked that her sister get paid $10 a week and that her own salary be raised to $25. The manager refused. But Charlotte was feeling her strength and the righteousness of her position, and she and her sister were immediately accepted at a theater in Philadelphia. P.S. It wasn't long before the Park Theater saw the error of its ways, and both sisters were asked back on their own terms. In 1844, at the age of 28, Charlotte played Lady Macbeth opposite W.C. Macready, a well-known British actor. He was so impressed with her performance, he suggested she come to England, where your talents will be appreciated at their true value. With this encouragement, she won her internal and external battles and traveled to England. It took her quite a while before she got her first role. When she finally did, her reviews were ecstatic. The London Sun said, "Since the memorable first appearance of Edmund Kean in 1814, never has there been such a debut on the boards of an English theater. She is, without exception, the very first actress that we have." And so eventually, Charlotte Cushman made her name in both America and abroad as the most celebrated woman in the English-speaking world. She was seen on stage by millions. They had parades celebrating her. Her performance as a cultural icon was truly unprecedented. And so ends this part of my story. Now, let's turn to Charlotte's personal life. She was aware, as were others who knew her, that being a wife could not be her choice. From the time she started playing breeches parts, it was kind of taken for granted, so that at the age of 26, when she met Rosalie Sully and began a short-lived love affair, it didn't seem to raise very many eyebrows. Nor would she have cared if it did. She was young, extremely talented, already quite famous, and a favorite of theatergoers, so she had the freedom to choose her lifestyle when few other women rarely had that choice. Charlotte and Rosalie were together for only a year, and Rosalie died a year after their breakup. Charlotte was very saddened by her death and fell into a depression. One of the ways she pulled herself out of it was to cultivate a number of women artist friends whose careers she helped to foster with both her prestige and her money. So notable were her philanthropic tendencies that in the 1940s, a foundation to help women in the fields of art and culture was set up and named the Charlotte Cushman Foundation. Back to 1848, when Charlotte was now 32. She met a journalist, writer, and part-time actress, Matilda Hayes, with whom she had a very close 10-year love affair. In Europe, they were publicly accepted as a couple. I don't think America was ready for that yet. 40 years later, Victorian culture took hold in Europe, and Oscar Wilde and others were actually imprisoned. What a world. Anyway, Charlotte and Matilda Hayes settled in an expatriate community in Italy in 1852, a community comprised of artists of various sorts, mostly lesbians. While there, Charlotte didn't do any acting, but used her fame to promote artists that lived in the community. And while there, due to some fractious events, Charlotte and Matilda parted, and Charlotte took up with sculptor Emma Stebbins. Throughout her career, Charlotte met and was very close to a number of notable people in the political and cultural world, both in America and in Europe. She performed before queens and kings, and in America was seen as Lady Macbeth by President Lincoln, who claimed it was his favorite Shakespearean play. He should have stopped going to the theater after that. Sorry, I digress. But it is ironic that Charlotte's final New York performance was at the Booth Theater, where she played Lady Macbeth, and her farewell performance overall was in Boston at the Globe in 1875. She was 59 years old. She retired shortly after to a villa in Newport, where she succumbed to cancer 10 years later. She was tended to by Emma Stebbins, who remained with her, despite her dalliances, to the very end. The New York Tribune's obituary notice reads, "There is something so awfully impressive in the vanishing of a great genius and a great force of noble intellect and character, that reverence must pause before the spectacle, no less in humanity than in sorrow." The future will speak of Charlotte Cushman with pride and gladness. The present can only tell her story in the quiet accents of grief.
Thank you, Gila, and thank you, Zoom audience. Today you heard Carol Shallon, Cece Sloan, Gila Zalan, and me, Estelle D'Annunzio. Be sure to be on the lookout for 3 more women hidden in plain sight this September 2020. If you have a special woman in history to bring out of hiding, please contact Cece Sloan. I've put her email address up on the chat, and thank you for coming.